So this is a joint project between my colleague Tim Bowley, my colleague Steve Carabas, who sadly can't be with us because he's teaching like crazy. And it's a book chapter that is going into a book that Giovanni is one of the editors with Luca Enriquez on shareholder engagement. And in this paper, our starting point was the fact that it's now 50 years since Albert O. Hirschman identified the options available for dissatisfied shareholders in an organisation. And they were basically stay and engage or get out of there, just exit. And Hirschman showed that the potential for greater engagement limited the need for exiting a corporation. And so we think that Hirschman's insights are highly relevant to current developments concerning sustainability and ESG issues. And that's what we're looking at in the paper. But two big things have happened since Hirschman's book. And one of them was what I thought was the elephant in the room in the last session, and that's the rise of technology. And the other matter is something that Cynthia talked about in one of the earlier sessions, the identity of shareholders, this major shift to institutional investors. And so the message from those developments is that basically public corporation shareholders are not homogeneous, and also the engagement methods that they now use with corporations and that other shareholders use with corporations are not homogeneous as well. And so our paper was designed to look at the shareholder meeting as a tool of shareholder engagement, but also these alternative methods of engagement. Now, the starting point in our paper was this very familiar old image of shareholders in the shareholder meeting. And of course, that old image was you just exit. You do the Wall Street walk, you put your money in another corporation if you're not happy with your current corporation. And under that image, Burley and Means saw shareholders as basically passive and powerless. You know, this is in their early 20th century pivotal work, The Modern Corporation and Private Property, 1932. They said shareholders are powerless and passive, they're dispossessed owners, they're incapable of collective action. They seriously need legal protection. And so the focus was on legal protection, not on participation in governance. And that image became hard-baked into US corporate law until the 1980s at least, where people either thought this was a problem that shareholders were powerless, or if you were in the law and economics camp, you thought it didn't matter that much because the market was doing the work for you. Now, the relevance of the shareholder meeting was diminished along with that image of shareholders. So Professor Burley later said that it was a kind of ancient, meaningless ritual, like some of the ceremonies that go with the mace in the House of Lords. So, you know, both diminishing the shareholder meeting and diminishing the whole of Britain. Now, the rise of shareholder power. Everything changes in the 1990s with the rise of institutional investors. But nonetheless, they're not necessarily the group that you would think would be great in this era of ESG. Because Gilson and Krachman in 1991 described the institutional investor as being, you know, a mindless, alternatively greedy and mindless paper colossus, less important than the real shareholder, whoever that might be. Then during the global financial crisis, we see this tension between institutional investors being seen as part of the problem versus part of the solution. And part of the solution is in the UK, where the view is that the global financial crisis was a problem because the institutional investors were asleep at the wheel. And Dionysius just told us about the growth of stewardship codes in the UK at that time to address that problem, to say to institutional investors, we want you to have a bigger role. In the US, they were seen as part of the problem, you know, driving managers to make more and more money. And so what we're seeing in recent times is this growth of ESG engagement by institutional investors. But as Dionysius said, the stewardship codes are quite patchy in terms of how much focus they put on ESG matters. You know, the UK now does put a lot on, but others do not. So sustainability and the shareholder meeting, I don't want to say much here, except that we really have seen the shareholder meeting go from being this, meaningless ritual to being a fairly important forum for shareholder engagement. But when we were writing this chapter, one of the editors, who was not Giovanni, kept saying to us, but can't we just do away with the shareholder meeting? And we wondered about that, could you just do it like during COVID, do everything, electronically? But we still think that shareholder meetings do have an important role. And we see that as a forum for activist gadflies in the ESG era. And so we thought it's still an important forum, but nonetheless an imperfect forum. And as a result of that, there are a lot of other engagement techniques that have been developing, which Tim is going to tell us about now in our 15 minutes.
Like an Olympic relay baton pass, smooth, hopefully. Okay, so the shareholder meeting has several limitations as an engagement technique. It's held once a year, a highly structured agenda. It's often very hard for shareholders to get proposals onto that agenda, depending on jurisdictional requirements. It takes place in public glare, which may not be conducive to a sort of an iterative, candid discussion between shareholder and company. And the exercise of voting power at a shareholder meeting can be an imperfect way of trying to influence behaviour. You vote no against something. It's a yes/no decision. You don't get to enter into a dialogue through the act of voting about whether the proposal could be changed or not. So what we see is, in light of those limitations, a whole number of alternative engagement techniques and mechanisms have been developed. And these are particularly favoured by shareholders when they're seeking prompt, direct, or iterative discussions with corporate managers. And these alternatives can be particularly useful in the ESG space when investors, shareholders are seeking to engage with companies on some fairly difficult sustainability issues. So the next couple of slides, I'm going to go through these different techniques, many of which will be familiar to you. And then at the end, I just want to wrap up and just look at what this fairly diverse engagement landscape means for corporate governance more generally. So in terms of alternatives, first main alternative is private or behind the scenes engagement between a shareholder and corporate managers. It can take place in a number of ways: private correspondence, telephone calls, meetings, and so on. Now, corporate managers are in general, are under no mandatory obligation to have discussions with shareholders. So the ability to secure this private engagement really is only available to significant strategic shareholders who have the leverage to get that access to directors and senior managers. So consistently, we see this as a favoured engagement technique of large institutional investors who can get those meetings. And feedback from companies, feedback from shareholders, including through their stewardship reports, and academic research all indicate that these private discussions are a key way in which institutional investors are engaging with companies on sustainability issues. We do see some non-governmental activist organisations use private interactions. Now, by that term, I'm talking about like organisations like Share Action or the Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility. They can, through their profile, sometimes get private discussions with managers. And the advantage of these private discussions in ESG space is, it allows iterative, constructive discussions around difficult issues that may take some time to work through. And a private discussion is often a much better way to try and progress such issues than, for example, turning up and agitating at a shareholder meeting. One final point about private engagement: it is not merely a bilateral exercise. So it is not merely an exercise between a single shareholder sitting down with corporate manager. These days, private engagement is quite often a multilateral exercise. So you'll have shareholder networks or representative organisations, for example, Climate Action 100+, and the PRI collaboration platform, facilitating interactions between multiple investors and companies. Okay, and public campaigns, another alternative. Now, hedge funds will sometimes use these public campaigns to exert pressure on companies, and there's been some notable examples. They are potentially costly to run, depending on just how public and prolific you want to be. And they can have certain downsides, reputational downsides. For example, if you go public and are then seen to lose the argument. Institutional investors, as you might expect, given their more constrained incentives to engage in corporate governance, tend not to use them. You will sometimes see those sort of NGO organisations that I mentioned earlier do so, but they will have their own cost constraints given their sort of NGO background and their reliance on more diverse funding sources. So you see it, but not to a major extent. Interestingly, the investor networks seem to be more prepared to go public. That would seem to be that whilst institutional investors don't like to do it, they're content for their networks to do it because you've sort of got a bit of distance between yourself and the network. So if it all goes pear-shaped, the network's fault, not yours. And those networks are potentially able to spread the cost of that exercise amongst their multiple members. Okay, technology-enabled engagement. This is a really interesting development. There now consists an ecosystem of technologies in the investment space. We have trading apps, Robinhood or Sharesies in Australia and New Zealand, that are facilitating low-cost trading in equity investments. We have all the social media and other platforms that can provide a source of information. And then we have some apps that allow specific discussions and coordinations around investments. So in Australia, we have one called Hot Copper, and I think Stockaholics is another example. Now, these technologies form an ecosystem that are particularly drawing in younger and smaller investors, making it easier to invest, and then potentially reducing their information gathering costs and their coordination costs. And we've seen them being used to engage in forms of activism, and including in the ESG space. So Tulip Share basically seeks to solicit investments in a company for the purpose of then aggregating those investments and then running some sort of shareholder campaign against the company. So, and it's done so against Coca-Cola, Amazon, JP Morgan, and Johnson & Johnson. And these technologies are particularly favoured by younger investors, and certainly my colleague Steve Carabas sees great promise because there's going to be a significant intergenerational change. These younger investors are going to become dominant investors in the market. They're tech savvy, and he sees a real future for this. I'd have three caveats. One is about the quality of the output. There is a risk that there's a bit of a rabble happening in some of these things. The next one I would say is there has been some research in America by Albert Choi and others who've looked at the companies that the meme stock companies. There was a lot of activity around them, but he and his co-authors argues that has dissipated, and that was just a product of the pandemic, according to them. The other thing is in relation to disintermediation, which Dionysia mentioned before. So these technologies potentially facilitate that disintermediation. The flip side of that, though, is you end up fragmenting a lot of shareholder power. There's been concentration in the institutions, and tech may allow some disintermediation so that underlying beneficial investors are giving feedback, but what you might end up is going from a concentration of shareholder power to a disaggregation, fragmentation. All right, so if you look at the Australian corporations legislation, you'd think that the only way shareholders engage with their companies is by turning up to the shareholder meeting. Clearly, that does not reflect reality, and we argue in our paper that we need to reconceptualise how shareholders engage with companies. And we make two key points. Firstly, it's a multi-dimensional phenomenon. Shareholder meeting, private engagement, technology-enabled engagement, Those techniques are often used in a complementary fashion. You might have a private discussion, you might not like the outcome, and then you run a shareholder proposal at a shareholder meeting. So it's a really multifaceted phenomenon. And it is large, to a significant extent, a network exercise, not bilateral, it's multilateral. We have multiple shareholders acting through networks and representative organisations or using intermediaries such as engagement firms to interact with companies. So what does that mean for the shareholder meeting? Does it mean it's redundant? We argue in our paper, no, it's not redundant. It's still very important as a forum for voting. Now, Giovanni's co-editor said, well, you could have voting take place as a written plebiscite. You don't actually need a meeting to have voting. That's a fair point, but the meeting has some other important benefits. It allows for face-to-face interaction between shareholders and corporate managers. And it also allows for what the American academics Nilly and Shana describe as horizontal democracy, interactions between shareholders, building coalitions on the floor, building pressure on the floor. Those opportunities may be particularly important when a company's experienced significant performance issues and there's a need for urgent interaction. That ability to come into a meeting and stare down managers and build pressure on the floor can be particularly important. Now, low attendance data suggests that shareholders do not routinely make use of those benefits. But we argue in our paper, we accept that, but say those benefits of the meeting are contingently significant. They come into play in moments of crisis. And so we argue that the meeting the shareholder meeting is relevant, but more as a contingent governance mechanism. I think the Delaware court described it as a residual mechanism of corporate democracy. And I think I'll stop there.